Good evening, and thank you for joining me for the second presentation that was given at the Snow Parma Library in Ohio called Oneness, the Nature of Duality, presented by Karina Wilkes. In order to get started, first of all, we have to imagine what oneness really would be like. So in this moment, I want you to imagine with your mind what it would be like to be in an ocean. And no matter where you looked, all you saw was more and more water. You look above you, there's water. You look below you, there's water. To the left, to the right. And no matter how far you go down, it's all water. You never hit a bottom where there's sand or something else. It's all water. Now that's kind of like what oneness would be like. There's really nothing, no separation, nothing that you can tell the difference between one thing and the next. The next thought process that I want you to think about is, well, with water, you can always talk about there being molecules, and the water is made up of all these different molecules. But if you really look at it, the molecules are all the same. This molecule is exactly the same as that molecule. So even then, even when you have some separation or some way to tell one thing from another, they're identical. There's nothing that distinguishes them and makes them special. Now I want you to imagine that we got a bucket from somewhere and we took a little bit of that ocean water and put it off to the side. And immediately that water begins to change. It begins to be a different quality than the ocean water. We might say that the sediments that were in the ocean water that's constantly being churned and tossed around and kept in solution start to come out and sink to the bottom. Also, we can imagine that we run this bucket of water through a filter and make it even more different, taking all the salts and everything out so that it's now fresh water instead of salt water. And each thing that happens to this bucket of water makes it a different quality than the ocean water. So our first idea here is that when you have oneness, you have something that is all the same. There's nothing that separates it. But once something is separated out, even if it is the exact same thing as everything else, it can begin to take on different qualities that makes it different. Let's take another look at another example here. I have a map of North America. And in this map, we see Canada, we see Mexico, and we see the United States. But there are no lines on this map. There's nothing separating the United States from Mexico, from Canada, and it all just looks like one big fat landmass, which is exactly what it really is. There's no real line between the United States and Canada. There's nothing really there. Instead, this is the way that we're accustomed to seeing it, like this. We're accustomed to seeing this map with a whole bunch of lines on it. They're all imaginary lines, lines in our head, lines on a piece of paper. And so originally, I came from Michigan, in fact, Detroit, Michigan. And so I'm considered a Michigander. But what really makes me different than an Ohioan now that I'm living here in Ohio? Really nothing. But yet something in the back of our head makes us want to identify with one piece of land over another, even though those boundaries, those lines of separation are arbitrary. There really is no difference between us and Texas, except maybe a different accent. But to be honest, these things are just in our head. We're all Americans, and we're all North Americans. The Canadians are exactly the same, and Mexicans are exactly the same. But we want to see ourselves as different based on these arbitrary lines. The last thoughts bubble that I want you to try to imagine is a room with no lights on, and you're in total darkness. I actually had this happen a few weeks back. I was parking in a parking structure that the electricity was going to be cut off on because it was attached to a building that they're renovating. And so they needed to turn the electrical off in order to install some new lines, I guess, inside the building. And that affected the parking structure that was attached to it. So they took the money when we came in instead of getting it when we come out. And they told us, well, you know, when you come out tonight, there's not going to be any electrical, so you won't be able to use the elevator, and we're going to leave the gates up because the gates won't work, and you just drive out. And I went on and parked there because it really didn't dawn on me what exactly no electricity meant until working 2 hours of overtime. I came out at about 7 o'clock in the evening. It was already dark. And there was another guy with me, and I'm parked on the 6th floor of the 6th story of this parking structure, and he was too. So we're both looking at each other like, okay, it's pretty dark in here. And then we got to the stairwell, and it was pitch black. So dark, in fact, that you could only see like a half a foot into the space, and then it looked like this picture here. It looked like a wall of blackness. You couldn't see the steps. You couldn't see the walls. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't see the stairwell, the railings going up. It all looked like one big black void, like you walked into the middle of nothing, the doorway to nowhere. Okay, and we both started to panic. And then he thought, well, I'm going to get my phone out. I'm going to turn the camera on and use the flash on it to see where I'm going. And he turned it on kind of like a flashlight. And so I got my phone out. I'm like, hey, wait a minute. Let me do the same. And we made our way up the steps just using our phones as light so we could see by. And just that little bit of light was enough to see the steps and see where we were going and to get to the 6th floor. But it was quite an interesting experience because, you know, I was coming up with ideas for this presentation at the time, and it just was a wonderful example of oneness, not being able to tell the difference between anything. Well, that last example actually is a lot like the first 2 days in the creation story in the Bible. And when we look at the Kabbalah, it actually follows the structure of those 2 first creation days. We start off in Keter, which is the unification of all things. That is, there is no separation. All energies, all the different patterns that it can make, all the potential patterns that it can make are all stored in Keter. This is the unification of all ideas and all understanding. That means there is no separation. They're all bound together as one thing. Chokmah is the sefer where you take one idea and you define it and you set boundaries for it. And then in Bina you find the structure of it. You define the structure of it. So as an example, let's say out of all the infinite ideas that are in Keter, I come up with something called a peanut butter sandwich. And I define it as 2 slices of bread with some peanut butter on it. That's my definition. And then in Bina, I start to look for structure. Well, I've got biscuits here, and I've got flatbread, and I've got some creamy peanut butter, and I've got chunky, and I've got some peanut butter made out of, that's mixed with other types of nuts. It doesn't matter. I put some jelly on my peanut butter sandwich. You know, does that count? So you start talking about different structures that are reliant on this new definition that we've made. We set a boundary and we called it a peanut butter sandwich. But when we look at the creation story, we see that the Keter moment is when the waters was in it was a void, and it was dark, and there was waters, right? And the waters were one waters, and the Spirit of God was going over the surface of these waters. And so in the first day, we have the command, let there be light. Why? Because you can't see anything in the dark. You got to have, the light represents understanding. It's like, oh, the lights are on. Now I can see how this water is different than that water. And I can see some differences here. I can begin to separate out some ideas, or I can separate the waters from the waters now, because I can see that this water isn't the same as this water. This is of a different quality. Maybe this is fresh water and this is salt water. I see the difference now. Let there be light. And then the second day, the separation occurs. So he begins to separate the waters from the waters. And this waters is the upper waters, and this waters is the lower waters. And so this separation is the first step in creation. First of all, seeing that there is a difference, or having an understanding that you can make a difference, that there is actually something that you can pull out and call it something new, and then actually doing that and defining it and setting boundaries for it. So the first thing we want to do is watch a clip that kind of goes over this whole creation process thing, and watch how creating boundaries in the creation process is important.
It is referred to as the architecture of the universe, and even the fingerprint of God. Sacred geometry is found throughout the natural world. Indeed, it is all around us, an aspect of the true matrix, if you have the eye to see it. It is also one of the very few subjects which appeals to both left brain and right brain ways of thinking at the same time. It satisfies the left brain's desire for logical, sequential, and objective data, or to put it simply, looking at the parts. It also satisfies the right brain's desire for random, intuitive, and subjective data, the study of the whole. It is simply not possible to cover all aspects of sacred geometry. People have spent entire lifetimes contemplating just one aspect of sacred geometry, such as a rabbi studying the Kabbalistic tree of life. I will do my best to introduce you to the basics and hopefully inspire you to research further on your own. The only logical place to start is to show you how nature created its very first pattern. Nature can also be substituted with God or Spirit, whatever is your preferred term, it doesn't matter, as they are describing the same one reality that we all share. It is also interesting to note that Genesis in the Bible essentially describes the process I'm about to show you. However, it should be told that this wisdom was most likely taken from the ancient Egyptian mystery schools, and that it is not original to the Bible. In the beginning there was the void, and within this infinite void is the Spirit of God. This Spirit has not manifested anything yet, so the Eye of Horus I'm using here to represent the Spirit of God is not a reality. In other words, essentially God and the void are one. But obviously I cannot show you God and the void as one, as they cannot be depicted graphically at the same time. That is the nature of emptiness. At this point there are no dimensions or space, and there is no time. There is also only two options available for God: remain in this state of static omnipresence or begin creating. God will begin creation eventually. However, as there is no time, it is irrelevant to ask how long it took to make the decision to begin creating reality. Okay, so now God has decided to begin creation. But before this can happen, God needs to create a canvas on which he is to paint his masterpiece. The first thing that God does is create the 3 dimensions. It does this by projecting a beam of consciousness from a single point in all 6 directions: front, back, left, right, up and down, in equal measure. Bear in mind that the void is infinite and that distance has not been defined yet, so it does not matter how far these beams are projected from the point, it makes no difference. You must also understand that what I'm showing here graphically is not a reality. That is, the structures being created are not material in any form, they are imaginary lines, they are pure consciousness. You may need to pause or replay this video several times before the implications become apparent to you. At this point, God is halfway to creating space. In order to complete this process, it must define some boundaries, because as I mentioned before, the void is infinite, and if no boundaries are defined, then relative movements of spirits remain impossible. To define some boundaries, all God needs to do is connect the end of every point to the end of every other point. The beauty of this, and indeed the entire process itself, is that God cannot make a mistake. It is simply impossible. Once all the ends are connected, what we have is an octahedron, which if viewed from the correct perspective reveals a hexagram, also known as the Star of David. Now that some boundaries have been defined, relative movements are now possible. The single point of consciousness can now move away from the defined central location, whereas previously there was nothing to move relative to. In the Bible, Eve was supposedly created from Adam's rib. Obviously this has no relevance to the present world, except maybe with unnatural fetus creation techniques. But when this story is compared with the next step in the process, you can begin to appreciate the idea that maybe the Bible is only an exoteric recreation of an older esoteric wisdom. The octahedron is made up of purely straight lines. In sacred geometry, straight lines are considered to be male, and curved lines female. So at this point, what we have is a purely male shape. This is why the Freemasons consider the male to be the generating principle. The next step involves spinning this octahedron in one full rotation around each of the three axes defined previously. Again, no mistake can be made. It does not matter which direction it is spun, or in what order the axes are chosen. The end result will always be that the parameters of a perfect sphere have been traced. Now we have a purely female shape. Eve has now been created from Adam. God has now created a perfect spherical membrane, and once again, it only has two options available. It can either remain static and explore this imaginary shape for all eternity, or it can repeat the process described thus far. The only difference is now God has a reference point, the spherical membrane, on which to repeat the process. It does not matter where spirit chooses on the membrane to begin the process, as it is a perfect sphere, thus all points are identical to each other. It cannot make a mistake. At this point, God only knows how to do two things: projecting an octahedron and creating a spherical membrane, and moving its point of awareness to what is newly created. The next step is described in Genesis in the Bible, and thus the next process is commonly referred to as the Genesis pattern. So God moves to the surface of the newly created spherical membrane and begins projecting another identical sphere. God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." This has created a very special shape called the Vesica Piscis. This shape can be found twice in your own body: the appearance of the human eye behind the eyelids, and also the lens within the eye, which adjusts the focus of light. The significance of this connection demonstrates both a left brain and a right brain idea, and it certainly shocked me when I was first introduced to it. Once again, God only has two options: remain static or project another sphere. To project the third sphere, God moves to what is newly created, which is this circle equator created by the two original intersecting spheres. Again, it does not matter where God chooses on this circle as the central point for the third sphere, as all points on this circle are identical. After the third sphere is created, there is only one more rule God follows when creating the rest of the spheres which complete the first stage of this pattern. The rule is, always move to the innermost circle points before projecting another sphere. This results in the process being perfect and prevents a chaotic mess being created. At the creation of each new sphere, more and more patterns or information become available, such as the Vesica Piscis mentioned earlier. The patterns contained within after each new sphere is added is far too extensive to cover in detail. All that remains to be said is after 7 spheres have been created in a vortex-like motion, what we have as a result is known as the seed of life. This basic pattern lays the foundation for the creation of matter and the universe itself. It also gives rise to a shape known as a tube torus if the pattern is spun around the central point. This shape is the only one in existence that can fold upon itself. It is also composed of 7 equal segments, which can be displayed visually using the 7 colours of the visible light spectrum. The seed of life is not the complete pattern. There are 2 more steps to take, which each reveal yet another layer, and also another new set of patterns and information. Following the rule of always move to the innermost points before projecting, God creates an additional 6 circles on top of the existing seed of life pattern. This motion is often referred to as the second vortex motion. This process is repeated once more, the third vortex motion, which finally gives rise to the next new complete pattern known as the flower of life. This pattern is found throughout the ancient world, but the oldest depiction was found at the Temple of Osiris in Egypt, etched into the granite using a process unknown to modern science. Once again, if we proceed through 2 more vortex-like motions, adding additional circles to the flower of life, eventually we reach the next new complete layer, the final layer as far as it is understood, known as the fruit of life. God has now finished creating the pattern which is used as a template for all material things. Remember, this pattern is still purely imaginary, purely consciousness at this point. You may now be starting to comprehend the basis of the idea that we live in a holographic universe. Everything can be reduced to just 2 things, structure and consciousness, although obviously even structure is derived from consciousness. It is a funny feeling knowing that you exist as a creation of consciousness, of God, given how solid and real the physical world appears. In the next video, I will expand upon some of the patterns and information contained within the forms I showed you in this video, and how this fundamental pattern, nature's first pattern, gives rise to matter, and how it is intimately involved with many aspects of the physical world.
Okay, so we've seen this pattern, and we can now talk about it in terms of what reality is. So if it is true that all matter, and it does, follows this pattern, the pattern of the seed, flower, and fruit of life, which it does, then we can begin to see how consciousness can be at the core of it. For example, I kept the same symbols here. This symbol here represents consciousness, whether you want to call that God's consciousness or a collective consciousness or just thought in general. Now, let's say that this circle represents me. This is my boundary. My boundary is my body. And this is you. This is your boundary and your body. Now, we see the world from different vantage points. Let's say this spot in the middle is the vantage point from which I view the universe. And this spot is your vantage point. Well, we are encased in a larger circle which embodies us both. Now, our consciousness, our thoughts, seem to be concentrated in one area. Like mine is here and yours is over here. And yet they're connected. They're connected through the greater sphere that is surrounding us both. This pattern is seen throughout the ancient world, just as it was put in the video. I chose this particular picture because it shows the Kabbalah by looking at the completed spheres inside the flower of life or the seed of life. You can see the Kabbalah model is clearly visualized there. It is clearly shown. And this is exactly where it comes from this pattern. We can talk about consciousness being, in ourselves, and at our level of resolution, we look at each other. I know you're conscious, you know I'm conscious, and we we interact with each other on that level. But at another level of resolution, let's say within my body, this pattern repeats. So each of these little circles are now my cell, and the big bounding circle is me. And at the cellular level, something is coordinating all these cells to work together. Something is communicating between them. I don't know how. It could be chemicals. It could be, that's what science would like to say. Or it could be something more. Who knows? Then there's another level below that. There is the level of molecules. And something coordinates those molecules so that they work together. And something is below that, the level of atoms. And something is below that, the level of subatomic particles. And something is below that, the level of quantum fluctuations, if you want to put it that way. And we can talk about what's beyond our body, what's outside. Let's say that this whole circle is my body, and what's outside of this circle is the Earth. And then what's outside of that is the solar system. And then what's outside of that is the whole galaxy. And then what's beyond that is a cluster of galaxies, and so on and so forth. So each of these circles are a boundary point, and inside each circle is a complete seed of life. Well, let's see how that works. In Judaism, as an example, the second letter, bet, means a house. And of course, we know what a house is. A house is a place where a family stays. And here in the picture, we see our family staying inside of their house. But the house forms a boundary. It forms a boundary around this family. And the family is defined as the household. And everyone else is outside. Family inside the house, everything else, the whole rest of the world, outside. We can also talk about the Temple of Solomon. Inside the temple, Israel. Outside the temple, everybody else. We can apply that again to the human body. Inside the boundary of my body is me. Outside the boundary of me is everything else. So a house or bet describes all boundaries and is actually the second principle of creation, creating boundaries. And we can talk about what's inside the boundary, and we can talk about what's outside the boundary. Let me give another example. Here in this picture, we have a pen. It's a nice black pen. And we can talk about what's inside the boundary and what's outside the boundary. Inside the boundary, we call all of that the pen, right? Inside this boundary is the pen. And outside of that boundary is everything else. We can talk about the color that we see as being black. It's a black pen with nice shiny highlights. Look at that, nice and shiny. And I see some white coming off of there, but I know that's a reflection. It's nice and shiny. And although we're seeing black on the outside, we have to realize that inside the boundary, this pen is absorbing white light. If we're seeing black, that means that all the visible light spectrum is being absorbed into the pen. So inside the boundary is white. When we look at the totality, if we were to take the inside and outside, we should get white light, because all colors of light, when they come together, make white light. So there is an illusion of duality. For example, we can talk about dark versus light. And we have many examples of darkness and light. But the truth of the matter is, there is no such thing as darkness. Darkness does not exist. You can't open a can of something called darkness and make a lit room darker. The only thing that darkness is the absence of light. You can turn a light down. You can dim it and dim it and dim it. And the less light there is, the darker the room is. So really, you're only talking about one thing. You're talking about light. You're not talking about darkness. You're talking about light. Or how much light you have. If you have a whole lot of light, it'll be blindingly bright. If you only have a little bit of light, it'll be very, very dark, maybe kind of grayish, maybe, shadowy-ish, where you can barely see. And if you have no light, it'll be absolute darkness. Let's take another example. Let's talk about cold versus hot. Well, just like with the light, there is no such thing as cold. Cold doesn't exist. What you're really talking about is an absence of heat, which again is a form of light. If there is no heat, then what you are feeling is a differential. So let's say, for example, I'm in my body temperature is 98.6 degrees, and I go into a room that is 100 degrees. Well, to me, that room is going to be stiflingly hot because it is 2 degrees warmer than my body temperature. And so my body won't be able to get rid of its own heat because it needs to radiate that heat out, and it won't be able to. Instead, it will be absorbing heat from the surrounding room. And so I will feel hot. Now take that same room and put its temperature at 70 degrees, maybe 65. Let's say 65. Now my body is a lot hotter than the room, and so the heat from my body wants to flow out into the room and leave me. And as it leaves, I feel cold. It's like, whoa, it's cold. But really, it's because the heat is down to 65. And I can turn that heat up. I can add more heat to the room until I feel comfortable. I can't add more cold to the room because there's no such thing. People might think that refrigerators would be an example of cold existing, but really that's not true. They have a compressed gas that as it circulates through, it absorbs the heat out of the compartment, out of the freezer and the refrigerator compartment. It absorbs it all. And so since there's no heat in there, it feels cold. It gets cold. It absorbs all the heat energy out. So it doesn't add cold in, it takes the heat out of the refrigerator space. What about something that isn't a physical property? Like both of these, dark versus light, cold versus hot, these are physical properties. And actually they're based on light, on the movement of light. What about something else, like good versus evil? Something that's maybe just ethics. It's just an ethical question. Could it be possible that there really is only one thing? There's only good and levels of good? Let's take a look at that. Is evil an illusion? Well, first of all, we need to realize that evil is not a physical force. Not like light or like me stomping my feet. It's not a physical force in that sense. We can talk about evil in terms of good. Let's define what good is. Well, when we receive something from someone, or when we receive anything, when we receive food, or some money, or a compliment, those things are looked at as being good. That was really good. It makes us feel good. We're receiving energy into our boundary. It's coming in towards us. And so we perceive it as something good. When we intentionally give some of our energy to someone else, we're doing good to that person. I'm giving you something to eat. I see a homeless man, I give him $1. I'm doing good for him. I'm not doing good for myself. We don't say that, but I'm doing good for him. I'm doing good to him because I am transferring some energy into his or hers boundary. However, if we talk about evil, evil is intentionally taking energy from someone. So I steal your wallet. I'm taking energy from you. That's evil. I pollute your water. Okay? That's evil. Because now you have to expend energy to make it right, to get rid of the pollution I just stuck in there. I just killed your mom. I took energy away from you. I took something out of your boundary. Okay, so evil and good actually are talking about the same thing. They're talking about energy. But it's the direction in which it's moving that we perceive good or evil. It's based on which way it's moving. Now, if it's moving towards me, oh, that's real good. That's real good. I have my arms open to receive the sunlight, to receive the blessings, as they say. But when it's moving away from me, when I have to pay taxes, when I have to, especially when I really don't want to give it. It's not coming. It's not leaving me intentionally. I'm not intentionally giving it, but you're making a demand of me. Well, now that's evil, and that's the way I see it. It's something bad. It's not good. It's something bad. So it's all about our perception of which direction that energy is moving. And there's only really one thing, the energy. Both evil and good are energy, but it depends on which direction it's moving. So now let's talk about something else. Let's talk about love. Because love is something that we get wrong all the time. You see, most people think of love as how they feel. Ooh, you make me feel so good. You make me feel, and I love you, I desire you, I want. These things are not love. I heard a rabbi talking on a video once, and he talked about how, Americans are always talking about how they love stuff, and they have no idea what the word love means. And he says, he heard one person saying that they love fish. Oh, I just love fish. And he said, well, if you really love the fish, you would throw it back in. You would let it live. And that would be loving the fish. Because love is not about how we feel inside. It's about how others feel and how we take care of others. It's about giving energy into other people's boundary. Caring about what's going on with someone else other than ourselves. See, it's real easy to get caught up in what's happening with this boundary of mine, with this body, with my life, and not really caring or seeing or really even being conscious of what's going on with other people around me or other beings around me, like animals and plants. I could just not see them. I could only care about me. And so if I only care about me, yeah, if something makes me feel good, I might think that I'm in love, but you're not really in love. You're only in love when you're willing to do something for that other being. And it has nothing to do with your feelings or what you're getting out of the deal. So that's really what love is about. I say that because when we are talking about love, the kind of love that people talk about generally, about their good feelings, about their life being right, about their blessings. I'm so blessed. They're really not talking about anything loving at all. They're talking really about their self and being selfish, selfishly gloating about how good their life is. While around them, people could be starving, they could be in the gutter, they could be suffering on all levels, and they can walk right past them because, you know what, I'm blessed. And I've got energy coming into my being, and that's all that's important. And so love is about caring about others. It's about caring for yourself too. But it's more about being aware of those other people around you. Then this next part, we're going to talk about oneness in the sense of quantum physics. What is going on with quantum physics, and what does it have to say about our reality? And we're going to listen to a physicist by the name of Thomas Campbell, who worked for NASA for a time being, and also worked for the United States government. And now he's retired, and he gives these lectures. So we're going to take a quick look at one of his lectures and what he had to say about quantum physics.
This is a double slit experiment. It's a very famous experiment. This experiment has probably been done more times, more places, by more people than any other single experiment in the history of science. And it's because it gives such strange results that everybody wants to do it and see if it works like that for them. So this has been replicated over and over and over again, and whenever done properly, it always gives the same results. It tells us something very important about the nature of reality. Here's what happened, and I'll show you why it's such a famous experiment. Early on, we knew that waves, if you had a wave came to this thing, we have a barrier, a hole, a barrier, and a hole. That's called a slit. And it's two of them. There's a double slit. That's where the experiment comes from. That if a wave came here, some of the wave would go through this slit, some of the wave would go through that slit, and the distance from here to here is a little shorter than it is from here to here, right? We can see that. That's pretty obvious. If that difference in distance turns out to be like this, so the wave coming from the top hole and the bottom hole are shifted in distance one whole wavelength, then they both dip at the same time, they both crest at the same time, and you get a spot of light there. But if they happen to be just that difference in distance, where one gets to a peak just as the other one gets to a hump, you add them together, you get nothing. That's why you get nothing there. So what happens is you get this series of spots. It's called a diffraction pattern when you have waves going through the two slits. So they did this experiment with the double slit. They found a way to just fire one photon at a time at the slits, a particle. What they expected to see was this. What they saw was a diffraction pattern. Okay, now that was a surprise. They didn't expect that. So they said, well, there's something funny going on here at these slits. So these little red things are detectors. And they said, we're going to put detectors there at these slits, and we're going to see what's going on. And they did. They detected every time a photon went through this slit, this detectors would say, it went through the upper slit, or the detectors would say it went through the bottom slit. And whenever they did that, they got this pattern. So now the problem was, we take the detectors away, and you get this pattern. Then the idea was those detectors, they're doing something there. But they found out, and these are called quantum erasure experiments, they found out that you could take this data with these detectors, take all the data, detectors are working, it tells you exactly what slit each one goes through, but you don't look at this data, and you don't look at that data yet, you just take it. Now if you look at it, you'll get this. But if you don't look at it, and then you erase this information of which slit they went through, you get this again. You see? So obviously reality is not objective. That's the double slit experiment, and that's why this is such a big deal, because it shows that reality is not objective. There's something else going on here. That's what we want to talk about. Well, I will give you a little experiment that I'm going to make up. This is not an actual experiment, what I'm going to tell you. This is just a logical equivalent, so it's easy for you to follow and understand. Actual physics experiments are very complicated, and they're very hard to explain, but this is, like I say, a logical equivalent. Let's say that we take 102 of this experiment. In other words, we're going to measure what slit it goes through, and then we're going to keep track of what happens over here on the screen. And we're going to do that just 102 times. And we're going to take data for an hour, put that in the computer, take the data again for another hour, put that in. And what we'll do is the first one we'll take this data, put it in an envelope, call it detector data, experiment 1, and we'll take this, put it in another envelope, call it measurement screen data, experiment 1, put those two envelopes into a big envelope and call it experiment 1. You with me with that? So I got an envelope that says experiment 1, and I've got inside that I've got two envelopes. One of them says detector data for experiment 1, the other one says measurement screen. So I've got all my data in here. So that's just an easy way for us to keep them straight. So we're going to do that 102 times, and because we're doing this experiment, we always expect that as the result. So after we have 102 of them, we look at the first one we did, and we take this data out of the envelope, take that data out of the envelope, and this is exactly what we see, just what we expected. That's the experiment we're doing. And then we take the last one we did, and we do the same thing. We want to make sure that they're the same, right, on both ends. So we do that, and we get exactly this. You know, we get the two spots of light here is what we get. So the first one and the last one are like that. We assume all the ones in the middle were like that because they were all just done together. All right, but now what this delayed quantum erasure means is that let's take the 100 envelopes that are left, right? We got rid of number 1, we got rid of the first one and the last one. Now we have 100 left out of the 102. We'll take those 100 and we'll shuffle them, we'll randomize them up. Then we'll deal them out into two piles of 50. Now, one pile of 50, we will look at them. We'll take the envelopes out and look at them, and every one of them, all 50 of them, will look just like this. We have the two spots here. Now, the other 50, we'll take out the detector data of each one of the 50, put them in a pile, and set fire to them. We're going to burn them. We're going to destroy them. That's our eraser experiment. Okay? I'm making a very simple concept in the eraser experiment. We just burn them and destroy them. And no, they're not still readable in the ashes. We'll take the ashes and put them in water or something. Don't complicate the experiment. We're just going to burn them. That's going to get rid of them, and they will be erased. And then we'll open up these envelopes, and every one of them will be a diffraction pattern. You see? That's what I mean by a delayed quantum erasure experiment. Every one of them will be. And you're thinking, how could that happen? You see, the experiment was done, let's say, a year ago before we took these envelopes out and sorted them. It doesn't matter. 10 years ago. The amount of time is irrelevant. In these experiments, they're actually done like 10 nanoseconds. But it doesn't matter. If you can do it in arrears, you can do it any amount of time. So that's why this is weird science. It looks like, depending on what you do with this data, you make this change from this output to that output, right? That's what it looks like. But that's just because you believe you live in an objective reality. You see, in a statistical probability reality, this is still indeterminate. It hasn't happened yet because you haven't looked. You see, you don't know what it is. In an objective reality, you know because you did this experiment, that's what it had to be. So you believe that's the way it is, and then you somehow magically changed it to this. Well, there's no magic involved. It's just that because this data hasn't been looked at, it doesn't really exist yet in this reality because we live in a probabilistic reality. I know you're thinking, that sounds impossible, but that's because you are ingrained from your culture with the concept of an objective reality. You believe that's the way it is, so when you see this or hear about it, it just doesn't make sense. Just like the world being around didn't make sense.
So now, we just heard from Thomas Campbell, and one of the things he said is that reality is not objective. What does that mean? It means that when something is objective, it means that it doesn't matter about your opinion, or it doesn't matter about some side things going on. If A equals B, then A will equal B all the time. it won't matter what you do, A always equals B. Just like 1 plus 1 equals 2 is an objective mathematic statement. But when things aren't objective, when they're subjective, it means that depending on who's looking at it, you're going to get a different result. The thing I like to relate this to is like Facebook. As everybody kind of knows about Facebook. We can kind of agree what Facebook looks like. It's blue. It's got a center thing with, a lot of posts from different folks on it. It's got a navigation thing on the side with your different groups and blah, blah, blah. On this side, it's got this other little smaller stream with a lot wider range of people who are posting things in more real time. However, the content of my Facebook is not going to be the same as yours because we don't have the same friends. And so I'll be seeing most of the posts that'll be in the middle will be people that I talk to all the time. Their posts are going to show up. Things that I click on all the time. And so those things will be pushed to the fore. And we will never be looking at the same exact screen because none of us have exactly the same friends who are posting exactly the same thing at the times that we're looking at them. So that's an example of something subjective. It is subject to my vantage point versus your vantage point. So when Thomas Campbell says that reality is not objective, it has to do with our awareness. If in my awareness I actually experience something and it's in my head, it's inside my mind, then I can possibly experience something that you don't see. Because for you, it hasn't happened yet, or you don't have access to that information. And so awareness becomes a component of our reality. One of the things that also comes out from this is that depending on whether the data exists or not, is whether or not the waveform collapses. Okay? And data exists for only one reason, to be read and to be recognized by some conscious mind. Can you imagine if a baby looks at some data? It won't mean anything. What does it matter if it's there or not? The other part of this experiment that wasn't really described but has been done is that if you look at the data and then destroy it, you will still get the double slits because that information is now in your mind. However, if you don't look at the data and you destroy it, you will get a diffraction pattern. So consciously looking does affect the data. It does affect what happens. The last thing he talked about was time and space. And it didn't matter if he kept those results, the detector data results, in an envelope for 10 years, 20 years. As long as no one had looked at the detector data or the screen data, and they were both covered up so we couldn't see, it doesn't matter how much time went by. If I destroyed that data, the printouts, and those could be photographs, it doesn't matter. Those could be photographs that were taken. They will change to match the reality that that data doesn't exist and no one looked at it. So the photo will show the diffraction pattern. However, if I do look, then those photos will show the double slit. And so something is rearranging the particles right on cue. And it can go back in time when let's say the photographs were taken 10 years ago, it can go back in time and change it to be what it's supposed to be, as if it knows. So time and space must be an illusion. The last thing that he really didn't touch on, but part of quantum physics, is that all realities could possibly exist simultaneously. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. You have this photon gun, or not a photon gun, let's say an electron gun. You're shooting electrons at the slit. When the electron leaves the gun, when it leaves out of that boundary, the gun, and it enters into space, it ceases to exist. And instead, it approaches the slits in superposition. The idea of superposition is that it's everywhere and nowhere at once. The electron passes through both slits because it really, or no slit, it passes through both and none at the same time. And if there's a detector on it, the detector will shoot a beam of light at it and cause it to collapse so that the particle is known. Hey, there it is right there. And from that moment on, if there's a detector there, it will travel as a particle and hit the screen as a particle. However, if the detectors aren't there, the electron passes through the slit. It passes through both slits at the same time, passes through even the barrier in all different manner of ways, okay, and it hits the screen in all possible places. That's not true. Over time, if you shoot many, you will get the diffraction pattern. When it hits the screen, it will hit in one spot. But if you do this thousands of times, you will get the diffraction pattern. However, if the detectors are on, you will always get a double slit pattern because the detectors will cause the superpositions to collapse into finite positions. So superpositions, another example would be one that I gave to some students at a junior high school. I asked them, I said, hey, who can tell me why space looks black when nighttime comes? And of course the kids, ooh, ooh, ooh. Because the earth is rotating and the sun is on one side and the other side is in shadow. I said, very good. Yes, that's exactly right. But I want you to think about something. Here the sun is, it's huge. And the rays of the sun are shooting past the earth. And Mars, which is further out, and Jupiter and Saturn, they all have morning time because the sun's rays go and it hits them. It's traveling past the earth and hitting these objects. And so the side that is facing the sun is getting lit up just like the earth is. So why is it that we don't see the light as it's traveling through space? And then it got really, really quiet. Because they didn't know why we didn't see those light rays going by. And so I told them, I said, because there's no matter out there. If there was matter out there, the sun's rays would hit those and bounce off into our eyes. But because there's nothing out there, the light really doesn't exist. When it leaves the sun, it goes into a superposition until it hits a boundary, which is why this whole topic of boundaries is very important. When it hits a boundary, it solidifies into this reality. And then it bounces out in all directions, carrying information about the last boundary it touched. So the reason why we see the last thing that it touches is because the light itself is carrying that information into your eyeball and into your skin and into everything that it touches. So it goes out from the source, touches a boundary, goes out in all directions. But the instant it leaves that boundary, it goes back into superposition. It is everywhere and nowhere at once until it touches the next boundary. And it transmits whatever information that it was carrying from that prior boundary, it transmits it into the new boundary. And then it picks up information from the new boundary and transmits itself again. And so all realities can receive all information at the same time, which is really an astounding thing for me. We can talk about this again in terms of Kabbalah, just those top three supernals, where Keter is the place of no boundary, just like space has no boundary. And then there's a boundary out there, and the light, it travels and hits that boundary and solidifies just for a moment, transferring information and then moving on. The last thing I want to talk about, kind of second to the last thing, is resonance. Back in 1952, Schumann, he didn't discover resonance. What happened was after 1945, when we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there became a big interest in resonance. Resonance on all levels. Sound resonance, which is the vibration of sound through matter. Sound causes matter to vibrate in a certain way. And they found, like with singers, that could hit a certain note. They would hit the high note, and that sound would disrupt the molecular structure of the crystal glass, and it would shatter because the molecules couldn't hold on to each other anymore because of the disruption due to that sound wave that came through. And that is because the resonance of the voice, it wasn't the same vibration, but it was the anti-vibration that caused the disruption. Or maybe it was out of phase with those vibrating particles. And so it became very interesting. When light hits a boundary, it causes matter to vibrate at a certain frequency. It increases its frequency, in fact. And so light hitting a surface creates a new resonance. It creates a higher resonance for that matter. We've used electron and magnetic resonance to actually take an image of something that is material. When you go get an MRI, that's exactly what that is, an electronic magnetic resonance machine. And lastly, we can talk about spiritual resonance. Our spiritual harmonic with the spirit of the universe around us, whether we're in tune with that or not. Well, Schumann, in his looking at these different frequencies, figured out a formula for determining what the Earth's frequency was, how fast it was vibrating. And he calculated that it was vibrating about 7.8 hertz, which is near a Fibonacci number. It's on the Fibonacci scale, 8 being a Fibonacci number. And so other scientists following his work they were able to make the same calculations. And later on, they found that the human body and the rest of the universe was also vibrating at some similar frequencies. Extremely low frequencies or ELF frequencies. Over time, though, they began to notice that this frequency of the Earth was increasing. And so, also, the frequency of the universe. And so, also, the frequency of the human body. So all of these things are connected. They're in lockstep with each other. When we talk about spiritual resonance, the ancients spoke of a time when there would be an awakening. There was a certain amount of time that needed to go by, and there would start to be an awakening where our resonance, our spiritual resonance would be heightened or would quicken or would become faster. And Jesus talked about that as the quickening, that the Spirit would quicken us, and we would begin to know more. There are ancient documents such as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth for the Egyptians and the story of Quetzalcoatl, which has to do with the Mayans and the Aztecs. So in these documents, we see that these things have happened before. As far as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth are concerned, and also other documents that when, I think it was Socrates, when Socrates went to the mystery schools, he came back and talked about Atlantis and about this shift that the people disappeared. And they disappeared into another dimension, according to legend. That is exactly what the Emerald Tablets of Thoth are about, this disappearing into another dimension. With Quetzalcoatl, Tetlak, who is a big trickster, came into the Toltec area and began tricking people into, I don't know, into dying, I guess. And he first went to Quetzalcoatl or was brought before Quetzalcoatl because his daughter, Shishimoko, had seen Tetlapoko and fallen in love with him. And in her heart, she was devastated that she would never get to marry this man because she was a princess and she had to marry a prince and blah, blah, blah. So she was dying because of her unhappiness. And so her father had agreed to let Tetlapoko marry his daughter. And so the people were upset by that. No, she's only supposed to marry a prince, and here's this outsider that no one knows about. But make a long story short, the story is about him tricking Quetzalcoatl into doing something that was pretty wrong. And so Quetzalcoatl banished himself and to the south, and he rode a raft of serpents into the south, but not before saying that he was going to return. On his journey to take that trip, the Toltec people came with him, and that Tetlapoko, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing his name right, Tetlapoko, was kind of tricking them in groups. And so the first group didn't make it very far. They didn't even make it out of the village, you know. They all ran over a cliff. And the next group, you know, and as they journeyed along, he kept losing people until at the very end, only Quetzalcoatl was left. And he's the only one that got to make it on that raft and sail away. So the Toltecs, they disappeared. Nobody knew where they went, and in one of their neighboring warring civilizations, I guess, they went looking for the Toltecs because they were afraid of the Toltecs because they had superior weapons. And when they went into their lands, they found that there was no one there. They were all gone pretty much, except for just a few leftovers. And they didn't know where they went to. So it was said that some type of tragedy befell them. Now, most historians look at the story of Quetzalcoatl and of the Toltecs and the kings that ruled over the Toltecs, and they think that these were not, even if they were based on real people, the story itself could not be, because the line of kings for the Toltecs only added up to 52, which is one of the sun cycles. 52 years is one sun cycle, and 52 years was not long enough to build as many pyramids as the Toltecs were supposed to have built. So they kind of think that this was symbolic of the calendar and of energies. So each king is a different type of energy and a different type of experience that would happen over and over and over again, like the seasons. In the Bible, there is a similar kind of thing that goes on. We talked about the quickening, and we can look at the Old Testament and talk about the Isaiah's prophecy of the new heavens and the new earth. There's also a legend, a mythology about the Feast of the Behemoth and Leviathan. Well, the Behemoth and the Leviathan are two polar opposites. The Leviathan, of course, is the great dragon that swims in the sea, and he is symbolic of total selfishness, whereas the Behemoth is a giant ox, and the ox, of course, is an angelic being that gives messages between Yahweh and the people. So at the end of time, people will either feast on the flesh of the Behemoth, or they'll feast on the flesh of Leviathan, and some will eat the Behemoth and some will eat Leviathan. And because of whichever one who chooses to eat the Leviathan, they will get stuck with Leviathan, and those who eat the Behemoth will get stuck with the fate of the Behemoth. And so there is a separation through resonance. If you resonate with Leviathan, well, that's the reality that you will be stuck with. And if you resonate with the Behemoth, well, that's the reality that you'll be stuck with. That's the resonance that you will have. Anyway, this concludes the talk on oneness. If you have any questions, please make sure that you write your questions on the YouTube page, and I will get back to you when I am able. Thank you again, and have a good evening.